Okay, so this is, like I said, more of a discussion, not me like uh giving up this presentation. So, um yeah, what I want these more technical discussions to be, like I said, we'll try to have a tutorial, but then kind of a something that's a little bit more broad, so not tool specific necessarily, but something that you might be using, a lot of people might be using at one time. Um, and this link is the same one that I just put in the chat. So if you have suggestions for an upcoming tutorial or a discussion you'd like to hear, I would encourage you to put it on there and we'll try to make it happen. So what is Docker? And this is when the participation comes in. So who can explain very high level what Docker is?
Docker is a container system that allows you to easily run a program, probably the basic.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a virtualization software, so it makes it really easier to deploy applications. So it kind of packages up all the necessary dependencies, everything you need to run an application. Um, and then someone else can use, the same command, no matter their operating system, to get your application and run it. Does anyone else use other kinds of virtualization software instead of Docker?
Yeah, so
We
that would be
use
Apptainer.
yeah, we actually use Apptainer in the IPD.
I've seen that it's Apptainer seems really common for like large clusters or HPCs. Um, yeah, so one thing on that is that when I was making the Docker images, so I made a Docker image the first time over the summer. It worked for Docker, but then it didn't work actually for Apptainer because your permissions are slightly different. So if you're building an image, that's something to kind of watch out for. All right. So this was something that I didn't know either. Does anyone know the difference in an image and a container? Just the vocabulary. Okay. So a container is an instance of an image. So you could have multiple containers running from a single image. So how do we get images?
From a repository.
Yes, so you can get those from different repositories or registries. So Docker Hub is a pretty common one, where I think most people get Docker images from. And the Rosetta Commons has a Docker Hub repository. So if you're interested in looking at Rosetta Commons offers, or if you have a tool that is, you would like Rosetta Commons to support, one step of that that we would like to add is a Docker image for that tool. So if you're developing, you can help us do that.
Can I just jump in? What's our update policy on those Docker containers? Do they get updated automatically when a new like PyRosetta version comes out or like a new RF diffusion version comes out?
So I think right now, we don't have maybe a standard policy around all the images, but I think they were being updated more on a periodic basis. So like every 6 months, or maybe it was less than that. Um, we did have a request recently come in for an updated PyRosetta image. So since someone asked about that, then Sergey was able to get that updated. So right now it's more of a time-based thing, not on like every single code change, there's a new Docker image. And you can also, if you have something you want a Docker image for, but it's not on Docker Hub, then you can build your own Docker image. So that's from, you'll write a recipe, and these are typically referred to as Docker files. And then each time you make this image, your image has different versions, which are called tags. And then for the most recently built version of any Docker image, is going to have the latest tag. So by default, that's what you'll pull from Docker Hub, or that's what would be used if you don't specify a tag. So just a real quick, because we don't have a lot of time, kind of the structure of a Docker file, you're going to start out with this from command that's going to start from a base image. Um, I would love to hear if people have like ideas on how they choose a base image when they're, building these. So the base image is really like a smaller image that your image is going to start from. So you don't have to build it from scratch. I mean, you're welcome to build it from scratch if you want, but I don't think that's the most efficient way to go about it. I will say that when I was learning this, I had a base image that worked, but it was not the most efficient one. So it was a pretty large base image. So you can kind of try to get the size. If you're worried about the size of your image, you can try to find a more minimal image that still has everything you need for your application to work. So does anyone have um, any ways that they go about choosing their base image, or do they always use the same base image? All right, so it's something we can work on, our base images. So there's other commands you can use. So the copy command essentially is going exactly like it sounds to copy files either from a different location or from your local computer where you're building this. So then that goes into the file system of the container that will be built for that image. The working directory, exactly like it sounds, it's going to set the working directory for the next commands. Um, you have the run command that's going to execute commands as like inside of a shell inside that container environment. And this is like where you would go about doing things like installing your dependencies. And then at the end, you'll have this command cmd that is essentially the command that when you run your container, um, that's what's going to get ran. So that command is going to be how you start up your application. So Docker has, so when you have an image, it has different layers. So every one of those commands, every one of those like the Docker commands is a new layer. And then things to keep in mind is that it is layer caching. So every time you do another build, so if you build your image again, it's going to look at the cache, and essentially anytime something changes, one layer changes, everything after that has to be rebuilt. So kind of best practices to make building these faster is to put whatever is going to change more frequently towards the bottom. So typically like our code, if we are writing an application, is going to change more often than the dependencies of that application. So you would want to kind of think about that when you're installing those. So install your dependencies and then pull your code. Also, each layer is immutable. So this is something that Sergey kind of had to teach me, that just because we remove something in a subsequent command, it's still there. So that doesn't make it smaller. It makes it where those files would not be accessible at the end once you once you run the container. But actually the size continues to grow every time you add something, even if you're removing it, but you can essentially string together your run commands. So it's all one command if you're trying to clean up some files. And then does anyone use multi-stage builds? Yazio shaking his head no. So I'm assuming nobody does. So multi-stage builds essentially have a second from command, and this would start a new stage where nothing's carried over from the last one. And the real one of the pros of this is to try to make your image smaller. So if you had a lot of dependencies that you needed to essentially build your application, but then you didn't need those to actually run that, you didn't need those at runtime, then that could kind of separate that out to help make your image smaller so that these don't grow too large. And any other Has anyone struggled with making Docker images or have any other thoughts on this?
My thoughts are that once a Docker image works nice, it works really nicely and it's super easy to use and it's very convenient. I guess it depends when you're building a Docker image. If you're not, the Docker images vary in size a lot for like RF diffusion or protein MPNN, and I'm not sure why that is. And also, there's like in some Docker images, there's like some startup pauses and stuff like that. So it sort of probably depends on exactly how you build the image.
I think that's one thing that we are kind of working on trying to have two different images where it's like one of the images has the weights. So like a user could just get that image, run the container and every single thing they need is already there. Versus if you don't include the weights, your Docker image could be a lot smaller, but then, you're counting on the user to then download those.
Or you could download them on the first use as well, right? If you, oh, you completely missed bind mounts. Did you? Did you talk about
I did
mounting
not.
paths? That's sort of the most important thing about when sort of using Docker, right? Because for the people who are not familiar, you sort of have to translate which paths in the Docker correspond to local paths in your like file system, and the main problem is that your home and the current working directory get bound automatically. So it's some things work with magic and some things don't. So this is sort of something to keep in mind.
Oh, I see that there are some things in the chat. Sorry, I missed that. So is there an advantage to using Docker over Apptainer? I think I'm not sure if there's an advantage. It's more of like what's available on the system you're using. But does anyone have any other opinions about this?
So I think one of the considerations is that Apptainer can typically use Docker format files and Docker images, whereas Docker can't use Apptainer. So if you're making an image or you're making a Docker format specification file, it makes sense to make it for Docker. And then whether you run with Docker or you run with Apptainer, that's really dependent on your system and what you have installed on your particular computing system. I think most of the cluster systems have Apptainer installed, just because there's some safety considerations there.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming.